welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a shortcut through one of the most foundational and, frankly, beautiful revolutions in scientific history, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution.
We're going to synthesize the intellectual history that made it possible, dissect the mechanism, and then review the huge pile of evidence that backs it all up.
To begin, let's start with a picture. Imagine a creature that looks almost too perfect to be real. The Malaysian orchid mantis.
Oh, it's incredible. It doesn't just sit on an orchid. It mimics the flower almost flawlessly.
Right down to the color and the texture of the petals. It's an amazing example of camouflage, of predator strategy.
And that one mantis, that single creature, it illustrates the three fundamental observations about life that Darwin was trying to explain. First, you see profound adaptation.
It's perfectly suited for its niche.
Perfectly. Second, you see unity. I mean, it still has the basic arthropod blueprint.
Yeah.
6 legs, those specialized grasping forelimbs, complex eyes, characteristics it shares with every other mantis.
And finally, diversity. It's just one of thousands of mantis species, all of them wildly unique. So how do you explain this? This trifecta of spectacular fit, shared blueprints, and just unbelievable variation.
The answer is the central concept of the Darwinian revolution. Evolution, which he defined as descent with modification.
In simple terms,
It just means that every species on Earth shares a common ancestor. But over vast periods of time, those ancestral lines accumulated differences as they adapted to different environments.
okay, so you can see it in two ways, right? As a pattern and a process.
Exactly. The pattern is the simple fact that life has changed over time. We can observe that. The process is the set of mechanisms, like natural selection, that cause that change.
So our mission today is to dive into how this powerful idea came to be, starting with the beliefs it completely overturned. What was the state of biology before Darwin?
Well, for centuries, the main Western view, and you can trace this all the way back to Aristotle, was that species were fixed, unchanging.
Right.
Yes. Aristotle organized life on this kind of fixed ladder of increasing complexity. He called it the scala naturae, the scale of nature. Every organism was perfect, permanent, and just sat on its assigned step.
But then you get figures like Carolus Linnaeus in the 18th century. Now, he definitely didn't believe in evolution. He was trying to classify life for, religious glory. But he introduced this idea of nested classification.
Right, grouping similar species into a genus, genera into a family, and so on.
And that's a huge irony, isn't it?
It's one of history's great ironies. By forcing life into these hierarchical groups, like with the binomial name, Homo sapiens Linnaeus accidentally created the perfect roadmap for common ancestry. His system only really makes logical sense if those nested groups reflect a shared evolutionary history.
So while he was organizing life on paper, the ground beneath this whole idea of fixed life was, well, literally shaking thanks to geology.
Exactly. The study of fossils, paleontology led by Georges Cuvier, showed that extinction was real. He studied fossils found in these superimposed rock layers called strata.
Deeper is older.
Deeper is older. And he saw that the older, deeper layers had fossils that were less and less similar to current life forms. And he saw these abrupt disappearances. He correctly inferred that extinctions were common.
But Cuvier was, it seems, desperate to keep the fixed species model. So his mechanism for this was something called catastrophism.
Precisely. He argued that discrete, local catastrophic events like floods destroyed life in a region. Then that area would just be repopulated by species moving in from other places.
So that keeps the Earth young and species unchanging.
It was the main intellectual battleground Darwin inherited. But then you contrast that with the work of geologists like James Hutton and Charles Lyell. Their big idea was gradualism.
So not catastrophes, but slow, steady change.
Right. They argued that vast, profound changes to the Earth-like canyons being carved or mountains rising happen slowly through the very same continuous processes that we can watch operating today.
And that was indispensable for Darwin.
Absolutely. Because if slow, subtle processes could build mountains over immense time, then the Earth couldn't be just a few thousand years old. It had to be ancient. And that deep, immense timescale was the critical ingredient needed for slow biological change to produce the diversity of life.
It seems like everyone was circling this idea of change. But before Darwin got the mechanism right, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck took a famous and flawed shot at it in 1809.
Lamarck deserves credit. He recognized that adaptation involved gradual change. His model, though, was centered on two main principles: use and disuse, and the inheritance of acquired characteristics.
Right, so if an organ was used more, it got stronger and bigger, and those changes you acquire in your lifetime were passed directly to your kids. The classic example is the giraffe stretching its neck. So its neck gets longer, and its babies are born with slightly longer necks.
Which sounds appealing, but it's fundamentally wrong when you look at modern genetics. Think about a bonsai tree. You can physically prune and shape that tree to be small and twisted. That's an acquired characteristic. But if you plant the seed from that bonsai,
It just grows into a normal full-size tree.
because the DNA, the inherited material, was never altered. Lamarck missed that crucial link between what you inherit and how you live your life.
That sets the stage perfectly. Darwin, born the same year Lamarck published, gets on the HMS Beagle in 1831, and he's carrying Lyell's geology book, which told him the Earth was ancient enough for this kind of slow change. And that 5-year journey was a complete game changer. He saw an earthquake in Chile that literally raised coastal rock beds, which just reinforced Lyell's gradualist view. But the real observational goldmine, that was the Galapagos Islands.
The Galapagos presented this incredible puzzle. Darwin saw distinct species that were clearly related to mainland forms, but also profoundly different. The finches are the most famous example.
Right, on each island, the finch beaks were perfectly suited or adapted for whatever food was locally available.
Exactly. Seed eaters had these powerful, crushing beaks. Cactus eaters had long, pointed beaks for poking into the fruit.
So this suggested that some ancestral finches got to the islands from the mainland, spread out, and then diversified as they faced different local pressures. It's that combination of unity, they were all clearly finches, and adaptation, each was specialized, that sparked his big insight.
And that spark led him to the idea of natural selection. Now, he sat on this for 2 decades, just compiling evidence because he knew how explosive the implications were. What finally pushed him to publish The Origin of Species in 1859 was getting a manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace.
Who had independently come up with the exact same idea.
The identical hypothesis, yeah, while he was working in the Malay archipelago.
It's amazing. 2 minds, working independently, gathering separate data, reached the same revolutionary conclusion. So let's unpack the core logic of natural selection. It's based on 2 observations and 2 inferences.
Absolutely. The first observation is simple. Variation in inherited traits exists within a population. Just look at Asian ladybird beetles. Some have more spots, some are redder, some are darker. That raw variation is just there.
The second observation is overproduction. Organisms produce way more offspring than the environment can support. You think of a puffball fungus releasing billions of spores.
Right. And this leads directly to a struggle for existence. Most are going to die or fail to reproduce.
Okay, so those are the facts on the ground. Now, the inferences that connect them.
Inference 1. Individuals whose inherited traits give them a slightly higher probability of surviving and reproducing in their specific environment tend to leave more offspring. They are, in effect, selected by nature.
And inference 2 just logically follows from that. This unequal ability to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits over generations. The result is better adaptation, like more effective camouflage or a more specialized beak.
It's a beautiful, self-evident engine of change. But it's critical to grasp 3 key things about how it works. First, natural selection is a process of editing, not creating.
Meaning, it can only select for traits that are already present in the population's variation.
Yes. The new raw material for that variation comes from random mutation and sexual recombination. Selection is just the filter. Second, remember that it's the population that evolves, not the individual.
Right. Lamarck's giraffe doesn't evolve. But the average neck length of the giraffe population can shift over many generations.
Perfectly put. And third, selection is entirely context-dependent. What's a benefit today might be a disadvantage tomorrow if the environment changes. There's no goal, it's just a response to local conditions.
So if this hypothesis is correct, we should see evidence everywhere.
Yeah.
And we do. You've broken it down into 4 main lines of evidence.
Overwhelming evidence. Let's start with something Darwin himself couldn't fully appreciate. Direct observations of evolutionary change.
So seeing it happen in our lifetime.
Or close to it. Look at the soapberry bug study. These bugs feed by poking their beaks through fruit walls to reach the seeds. Researchers compared populations feeding on a native vine with deep seeds to populations feeding on an introduced tree with much shallower seeds.
And what did they find?
In just 35 years, an evolutionary blink of an eye, the populations on the new tree with shallow seeds had evolved significantly shorter beaks. It's a rapid, measurable shift.
A much more urgent and frankly scary example is drug resistance in bacteria. specifically MRSA.
Yes, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. This shows the editing process perfectly. When penicillin was introduced, resistance appeared almost immediately, so they developed methicillin in 1959 to kill those resistant bacteria.
And resistance to methicillin appeared 2 years later.
Because the drugs don't create resistance, they just kill all the susceptible bacteria. The few individuals that, by random chance, already had a gene that let them survive, well, they lived and reproduced. We created a selective pressure cooker.
Okay, moving to the second line of evidence, homology. This is all about similarities that come from a shared ancestor, tracing those common blueprints.
The physical evidence is really powerful here. Look at the homologous structures in the forelimbs of mammals. A whale's flipper, a bat's wing, your arm, a cat's leg.
They all have the same basic arrangement of bones.
The same bones, humerus, radius, ulna, all adapted for totally different functions, but the underlying pattern was inherited from their common mammalian ancestor.
And we see this even before birth in embryos.
All vertebrate embryos, fish, humans, you name it, they all temporarily have a postanal tail and pharyngeal arches. In fish, those arches become gills. In us, they contribute to the structure of our ears and throat.
And then you have vestigial structures, the leftovers, like the tiny leg bones you can find buried in some snakes.
Exactly. And this homology goes all the way down to the molecular level, which is the deepest evidence of unity. Every form of life uses virtually the same genetic code. We share homologous genes with organisms as distant as bacteria.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
But we have to be careful, right? Not all similarity is homology.
Correct. You have to watch out for convergent evolution. This is when two very distant lineages evolve similar features independently, just because they faced similar environmental challenges.
These features are called analogous.
Right. Similar function, but not from a shared ancestor. The classic example is the Australian sugar glider, a marsupial, and the North American flying squirrel, a placental mammal. They look almost identical, they both glide, but their internal biology confirms they evolved those gliding flaps completely independently.
Okay, that brings us to the third line, the fossil record. This gives us the story over time, the great transitional forms. Let's talk about the incredible story of whale evolution.
Cetaceans, yeah. So DNA evidence had long suggested that whales evolved from land mammals, and that their closest living relatives are the even-toed ungulates, hippos, cows, that group.
But proving that meant finding the transition in the fossil record. And the key was hidden in a really small bone, the ankle bone.
Yes, the astragalus. Early fossil whales, like the wolf, like Pachycetus, had an astragalus with a unique double-humped shape. That shape is found only in even-toed ungulates. It's a smoking gun.
A landwalker's ankle bone in an early whale.
Exactly. And then later fossils like Rhodocetus and Dorudon document the shrinking of the hind limbs, the development of flippers. They completely fill in the gap between a land-walking ancestor and a fully aquatic modern whale.
Incredible. Our final line of evidence is biogeography, the geographic distribution of species. This is biology dictated by geology.
Biogeography, especially when you consider continental drift, the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea, lets us make really firm predictions. For instance, because the modern horse genus, Equus, originated in North America, we predict the oldest Equus fossils should only be found there.
And they are.
And they are. Or think about that mystery of the freshwater fish, the Glaxidae. They're found in places like South America, Australia, Tasmania.
Separated by thousands of kilometers of salt water they can't cross.
Their distribution only makes evolutionary sense if their common ancestor lived all across the southern landmass of Pangaea before it broke apart 55 million years ago. Their current locations are basically a fossilized map of plate tectonics.
So we have direct observation, shared blueprints from homology, the timeline from the fossil record, and the map from biogeography.
All supporting the pattern of evolution. This is why we call evolution a scientific theory. It's not a guess. It's a comprehensive, massively supported framework that accounts for a huge array of observations from almost every field of science.
And what's really amazing is that while Darwin thought this was an incredibly slow process, examples like the soapberry bugs and MRSA show that selection can drive massive change in just decades when the environment changes dramatically.
Absolutely. The modern synthesis only underscores Darwin's genius. He wrote about the grandeur in this view of life, in which endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. You can see that grandeur in the diversity of 1,000 species of mantises.
But the real intellectual power here, the profound idea for you to take away, is that while descent with modification explains all the differences, it's the molecular homology that explains the unity. Every time you think about your own DNA, just remember that you share the fundamental code, you share homologous genes with the most ancient and distant bacteria. That genetic kinship connects all life on Earth across billions of years and millions of generations, reflecting a unity that's far deeper than any surface resemblance. That is the true grandeur of evolution.